Before we go on to the meat of the afternoon session, which is starting to dig really into what a LEAP assessment is and how you might start going about one, I just wanted to cover briefly the specific goals of the Global Biodiversity Framework. There was a question over here about KPIs, which I'm not sure I did proper justice to, so maybe this will speak to that slightly as well. So essentially, we have this the Global Biodiversity Framework, which it's been billed as the sort of the Paris moment for nature, the time when there was a coming together, and the most important thing is there is an agreement of quantitative, measurable targets. There were previous targets for biodiversity in the HE Convention, but very few of them were really quantifiable and measurable. And as a global community, we missed every single one. So there's a hope that by having these goals and quantifiable targets, and that these, through the global process can be translated into national biodiversity strategies and action plans and BSAPs, that we'll actually see movement in the same way that we are starting to see for climate. And as I was saying in response to that question, these goals do start to give some ideas for the types of KPI that you can use for measuring and assessing progress and contributions towards nature positive. So the four main goals, I'm sure many of you are aware of them there, but goal A is the state goal. It's the outcome goal for biodiversity, and it's quite a wordy goal. We've abbreviated them here, but it's got a piece around maintaining connectivity, integrity, and resilience of existing natural ecosystems, and then increasing the area of natural ecosystems towards 2050, and maintaining genetic diversity. And then there's a specific part around extinction. So halting actual extinctions and reducing the risk of further extinctions. So that's the sort of the outcome target for the state of biodiversity. Goal B is the outcome target in terms of what they call nature's contributions to people, which is essentially another way of saying ecosystem services. So ensuring that people can continue to benefit from the various services that nature can provide, whether that's nutrient cycling, erosion control, or provisioning food, fiber, timber, for example. Then there's goal C, which is around benefit sharing, and particularly around the use of genetic materials. So genetics can inspire new medicines, new technologies, and ensuring that those benefits are appropriately shared. And then goal D is more of an implementation one, about having the means of implementation, recognizing that not every country in the world is in the same position and has the same capacity and resources to get started. And so there needs to be some sharing and financing. And financial institutions have a role to play in supporting all of these and ensuring that activities that are financed are aligned with them. Most of the goals do have quantitative, they're set a long time horizon, 2050, but they have shorter term targets, so 2030 targets sitting underneath them. And there's a lot of them, but we can summarize a few. Target 1 is around restoration, so bringing 30% of land that's already degraded into restoration by 2030. So it doesn't mean the restoration is complete by 2030, but the process has begun, because restoration takes a very long time. There's a target around protection, so protecting at least 30% of land, sea, and fresh water by 2030 as well. There is a target 14, around integrating biodiversity and nature into decision making. So that's around, for example, questions around capital allocation. Target 15 specifically mentions the private sector and is around disclosure. So it's encouraging countries to require assessment and disclosure of the company's impacts and dependencies on nature and what they're doing about it. And then there's a financing target about increasing the level of finance for positive biodiversity outcomes. So Each of these are reference points that can be used to evaluate whether a given allocation of capital, a given investment is aligning. And the challenge is, how do you translate these global things into targets for individual organizations? This is what I was trying to get at earlier. So, those goals essentially set out some global KPIs around the extent of natural ecosystems and the integrity and resilience of them. So how you can measure that through the condition of the habitat. There's a component there around extinction risk, and again there are metrics which are out there which you can use to measure extinction risk. That's about species. And then you can take the targets and align them with the different pressures. Each of the different pressures has either in the Global Biodiversity Framework or in the Paris Agreement a global target, and that can be the basis for setting a KPI and setting a level of ambition. So, for example, I mean, going through there, we've got the close to zero loss of areas of high ecological importance. So that's the equivalent, for SBTN, they talk about zero conversion. But that's one element of the goal. So reducing the conversion of areas of high biodiversity importance to close to zero. That's an objective that an organization can set, and that's something that's measurable. It can be tracked. There are others, I mean, I won't go through all of them, but for example, for pollution, the Global Biodiversity Framework target is around a 50% reduction. Now, that's a starting point for setting targets, but of course, and that's the global ambition is, as a whole, we want that's the reduction, but in a given landscape and for a given actor, maybe a greater or a lesser reduction is more appropriate. So we use the example of eutrophication, for example. So that's when nitrogen or phosphorus runoff, typically from agriculture, goes into freshwater ecosystems and changes the ecology considerably. But it's something that has a tipping point. If a little bit of nitrogen doesn't really change much, but once you go over a threshold, it flips into a completely different state, and it's really hard to reverse. So the amount of a reduction that is necessary to maintain a high-quality ecosystem in a given watershed, a given a river basin, for example, is very dependent on the current state and how polluted it is already. So you can't just take 50% and apply it everywhere and everything's okay. So when you're at the landscape, that's where, fortunately, we have the Science Based Targets Network. They have a methodology for working out what a sufficient reduction would be in a given watershed for that pressure. So I think hopefully that goes back to that question and just illustrates that the Global Biodiversity Framework, it sets a high level of ambition, but it also provides some practical information that can be used to structure targets and hence investment decisions. Though for certain things, there's still quite a lot of work to be done. And I should mention here that whilst there's agreement on the high-level indicators, like the extent of natural habitat, that's part of the Global Biodiversity Framework, there are many different ways of measuring that. And there are processes underway at the moment. So for governments, that's one of the things that's going to be discussed in the Conference of the Parties, COP16 in Cali in a few months' time, about how governments will measure progress towards the Global Biodiversity Framework. And for companies and financial institutions, there's an organization called the Nature Positive Initiative who are working right now to try and derive some consensus on what are practical ways to measure that. Because TNFD, which we'll talk about, that's what we'll move into talking about now, is not prescriptive. TNFD just says, these are things you should measure, but it doesn't say how. It provides some criteria to choose how that you can use, but it doesn't say this is the way. And so to fill that gap, there are other organizations now sort of moving in, to provide that sort of guidance. So yeah, I just want to sort of close out the morning session by, emphasizing that the Global Biodiversity Framework, as well as that high level of ambition, it is a tangible It does have some tangible, useful things which can be used to structure decision making, and there are ways of measuring alignment. And we'll start now to go into the detail of how you might do that. I'll hand back over to Grant.
Oh, should be back on now. Yeah, thanks, Malcolm. So a reminder of where we are in the program now. So this afternoon we're going to be talking about, first of all, why doing a LEAP exercise is worthwhile, how to prioritize what it focuses on, and then the last two sessions will really be running you through what the existing tools and data allows you to do with regards to LEAP, particularly this first pass of LEAP that I described in the morning. So this heat mapping, screening, this real first phase, we're going to show you how that how certain tools are already enabling that, and therefore how you can already judge the financial materiality up front and determine what you do a LEAP process on. Okay, so first and foremost, we'll run through till about the 2 o'clock mark and then just have kind of a quick bathroom break. It's going to give an intro to TCFD, TNFD and the LEAP process, and then talk about some of the benefits. So the benefits from a risk management point of view, from a reputation and reporting point of view, and from a revenues point of view. So revenues meaning the sorts of clients that you have, investments that you have, products and strategies that you can develop. Okay, how do TCFD and TNFD overlap? So first thing to note is that in the development of TNFD, there was something called general requirements, that those were not a part of TCFD, but they in essence existed, one, because of the need to break down what was meant by materiality. So were we talking about impact materiality or financial materiality? And it was really just blowing that out a little bit more. The second part was the need for integration. I mean, TNFD is coming along a little bit later, so integration with our sustainability initiatives. And I'll come into this in a little bit more detail, but stakeholder engagement was also super important. Then in the recommendation section, there is very much alignment. You've got the same governance, strategy, risk and impact management, and metrics and targets pillars as TCFD. The main difference is that there is 14 disclosure areas rather, so an additional 4 to TCFD, which again, I'll come on to in a second. And then all this other stuff at the bottom, LEAP, and then the additional guidance around biomes and by sectors, including for finance, and the various scenario analysis pieces and so on and so on. This is all been additionally developed, again, to empower users. So here are all of the 14 disclosure recommendations, and the ones in blue are the ones that are in addition to TCFD, and that don't kind of mirror TCFD directly. There's a couple of ways to characterize these. The first is location. So we've talked a lot about the importance of location to having any sort of decision useful analysis or actions for nature. So location. And then the second point is around value chains. So much more of an emphasis on understanding the upstream value chain from the company's operations. And then last of all, affected stakeholders, which I mentioned before. So you'll see this in the governance pillar. So you see there a description of how effective stakeholders are engaged, e.g. indigenous and communities at the ground level. And again, this kind of is a combination of the location-specific importance when it comes to nature, but it's also a product of learning where there's been tension when it comes to the climate agenda and the impacts of climate transition on the ground. So those points I just made are summarised on the left, but I think it's just fair to say that, again, because of the data point that we made earlier on, that this can be challenging to financial institutions. So it's super important to prioritise where you're going to do analysis and where you're going to do engagement. And this brings us to the different layers and levels of LEAP. So where is the highest likely impact and dependency, the highest opportunity to reduce that, and the highest receptiveness to engagement. And that's why, if you were to look through the TNFD guidance, you will see this inverted triangle at some point. Because in essence, there's an acknowledgement here that you as financial institutions will need to begin with the heat mapping phase to understand where the material exposures are most likely to exist. And then, based on the implied risk there, you'll need to try and get as much asset-specific information as possible, which you could describe as asset tagging. So that is increasing location specificity attached to assets, which then nature-related data could be attached to. So to make this tangible, that could be about whether or not the operations border biodiversity sensitive areas, or indeed are in protected habitat protected areas and therefore need special attention, those that Malcolm mentioned earlier on. Or it could be something about the water catchment area and the level of water stress in that location where people are operating. So it's about saying, what are the company operations or value chain information, sourcing location, and then associating that with nature-related data. So that would be what would meant by the asset tagging level. And then below all of that, there's this scenario-based risk method. So more specifically, what is the financial implication? And this kind of mirrors LEAP in the following way. So you have, first of all, locating the interface. So I've mentioned how that interface could be at the sectoral level, but as soon as you drop down, it's getting much more specific. And then that evaluation step, again, evaluating what does that interface with nature look like. And then for assessment, this is where you start needing really, honestly, the scenario-based work to come in. You need some sort of a view of the future with regards to that location. You know, what ecosystem services are under stress? Where might the opportunities be to mitigate impact, and maybe a cost-benefit analysis around where mitigating impact is the smartest choice. So that's like a forward-looking view of what the risks and opportunities are, both from a financial materiality point of view and an impact materiality point of view. So it's that forward-looking element to it. And then after all of that, of course, you've got the preparation, which is really about, okay, well, how are you going to report all of this out? So that's what the P step refers to. The way I'd characterize all of this is that the LEAP process is really very much, for financial institutions, I think very much in service of the assess phase. And I spoke about this a little bit over lunch with a few people, but you know, in essence, you do get the challenge rightly a lot from financial institutions, which is, well, where is nature loss financially material in my portfolio? And, you know, to answer that question with a degree of confidence requires us to do a LEAP process, an LEA process, not just at that portfolio level, but at a more explicit location level with a forward-looking view of the sorts of emergent nature-related physical or transition risks that there might be, which is, dependent on a scenario. So that's quite a heavy lift, is the point. And I don't think we're trying to sugarcoat that, but throughout all of these workshops, the intention is to show you how both the data and the techniques and the evidence and the examples exist to go through that today. Okay, so just quick takeaways from that beginning landing. So built on the same structure, there's a few additional components. LEAP process, it works best with location-specific information, but you can use sectoral data. As I said this morning, the purpose of that, though, is to prioritize deeper dive assessments. But fundamentally, this is about assessing nature-related exposure to where there are material impacts and when there are material financial considerations, and ultimately that's the goal of the process from my perspective. I mentioned we would cover some of the various benefits. So beginning with maybe the simplest one, which is the reporting benefits. So first of all, to kind of before showing how LEAP and TNFD overlaps with other things like CSRD and ESRS and SFDR and so on and so on, it's just to show you the LEAP process in a little bit more detail. So the locate step at the beginning, honestly, is all about traceability. So this is a way of characterizing the beginning, is that how visible can you make that interface with nature? So this is going to connect up with any frameworks, be it SFDR or ESRS, will ask there to be some sort of prioritization based on location or prioritization based on where the interface with biodiversity is the most material. So that's what locate should aim to do. In terms of evaluate, okay, so that's the measurement of that, so somehow quantifying that relationship. So that's when you're actually going to be doing the materiality disclosure and the dependencies disclosures under the existing frameworks, and then assess actually, from my point of view, when we start pushing into the financial materiality point, even though that is a requirement under TNFD, it's not a mandatory requirement for the other regulations as they stand. So to show those in a little bit more detail, okay, so here's the details slide. So across the frameworks, you have all of them work with the concept of priority location. That's mainly biodiversity sensitivity. So that's where some information is extremely helpful. LEAP increases the prominence of location specificity, as I've outlined. The frameworks along for ESRS and TNFD, it covers the whole value chain where that information is available. SFDR is just downstream in direct operations of investors. And then moving into materiality and dependencies, what I'd highlight here is that if you were to do a LEAP, I'm just going to try and simplify this. If you were to do a LEAP process, you will be able to cover off all of the variety of requirements under ESRS and SFDR as they currently stand. And that's, I think, the main takeaway. So, for example, SFDR, there's a requirement to report negative impacts, which will be fine. And under ESRS, the disclosure that, particularly for financial institutions, looks like it will be done today, can often utilize the tools that data providers, be they footprinting tools or providers like MSCI use. So again, it's just about highlighting where the most likely dependencies and impacts will be. So LEAP's going to go beyond this. This is really what I wanted to say. LEAP's going to go beyond all of this. So doing it in a good way is going to position you to be best in class. And this is the point that I'm looking to drive home here. It's not just about reporting, it's actually about informing management decision making. And it's actually about providing, I think, information to shareholders and to clients that goes beyond, yes, we just ticked a box. That's really the differentiator I want to underline here, because as Malcolm outlined, those targets under the GBF, we're not actually close yet with the disclosure frameworks for understanding what best practice looks like for corporates or financial institutions in terms of aligning with those targets, and people are thinking that through. But what we need to be showcasing and doing with LEAP is enabling us to actually put in place through that interface analysis what those targets can feasibly look like. And I can see a question in a second, what those targets can feasibly look like. And so this is also setting us up for success in that way, because right now the regimes haven't really got to that point. Yes. Thanks, everybody. Move on to the risk management benefits. So again, focusing on the ability to get to that assessment step of LEAP after understanding the interface and evaluating it. This is fundamentally enabling us to understand how nature and finance are connected. and you see this type of what you would call a transmission channels flow chart represented in a number of places now. You'll see a number of central banks using it and others using it. In essence, it begins in nature and in the responses to nature loss on the left-hand side. So what's happening that's degrading nature that results in physical risks, and then the responses to those, be those transition risks, new policies, new pieces of regulation, or liability risks, so people that bringing legal challenges or otherwise because of the degradation that they've seen happen. And of course that impacts companies. So that might impact their ability to operate, that might require that they make new types of investment, and of course then by extension impacts financial institutions and results in what we would call nature-related financial risks and opportunities. And of course the financial institutions are exposed via the loans and the debt and the equity holdings and so on. Now in terms of the types of transmission channel, I've got them there on the right hand side because I think it's just important to outline what they are, given this is the key connection between the sources and the exposure, which is first of all disruption. So disruption of activities refers to those kind of temporary additional costs of doing business. For example, it could just be their transport route is blocked because there was a landslide, and there was a landslide because the forested area around that piece of transport infrastructure had been deforested. It could be raw material price volatility, so degradation of pollination or soil services in areas of agricultural commodity production could result in yield volatility, which then results in price volatility. Pricing externalities more refers to, say, the transition risk. So, say taxes on nitrogen fertilizer would be an example to reduce water pollution. And then you've got stranded assets. So you premature write-offs. I mean, we spoke earlier on about what happens to those mining assets or those other assets that might become less and less worthwhile holding because of policies coming within the horizon of the operational life of the asset. And then adjustment or relocation of activities, so for example, anti-deforestation regulations might permanently change international trade flows. We already see how coffee will need to be imported from Brazil rather than Southeast Asia because that's the area that is more ready to comply with the European deforestation regulations. So you could have, the operating environment permanently altered. So where rainfall cycles change, or where there are complete changes to the way that the ecosystem services are currently being provided. And then last of all, capital destruction. I mean, maybe the road was destroyed. Maybe the factory, was destroyed by a landslide or something like this. So capital destruction. So these are the connections. I think it's really important to note those. And blowing this out a little bit more and kind of relating it to the future workshops too. So LEAP enables us to make that connection. So you can see from earlier on today the types of risk that the ecosystem services, in terms of the physical risk, the ecosystem services are at risk due to those 5 drivers that we've mentioned a few times, those 5 pressures, and then the transition risks are response to that. Those risks then tend to manifest as a decline in the services that nature provides. These are consolidated down to 5 categories just for ease. Hazards being regulated, so that could be regulation of zoonotic diseases like COVID or water security. But this is a mixture of the provisioning and regulating services that nature provides. And then the transition risks, of course, are a result of policy or investor and consumer sentiment. So that then has these impacts, which I've run through, these different types of transmission channel. And then you've got your credit risk, so your increased probability of default. You've got your market risk, your equity value at risk to investments, liquidity. That might be something around coverage of hedges that you've got on your commodity strategies or your commodity purchasing plans. And then business, so again, COVID's quite a good example because everyone all of a sudden needs to work from home. That doesn't work from some industries, so there's business risk. So this is like mapping along LEAP at the bottom, enables us to kind of get through and actually have an assessment of the financial risks and opportunities that we're facing. And to kind of summarize this risk management section, I was really struck by some remarks that Emmanuel Faber gave at COP15, who's now the chair of ISSB and was the CEO of Danone, where he said, and this is to paraphrase a little bit, but he said, access to thriving nature will become a source of competitive advantage. And that's really kind of what's trying to be captured by that flow chart, particularly under the physical risk side, is that, by understanding and by going through the LEAP process and understanding the consequences of the interfaces that you have, then it is possible to understand where and where not thriving nature is in your financial portfolios, the value chains of those that you finance, and therefore where there might be competitive advantage from a resilience point of view. And I think that's a really nice way of summing everything up. So yeah, the ability to connect the natural and financial worlds is really the core benefit of LEAP. So I think the reporting benefits are certainly there, but I think this is where we start getting into actually having a different message going up to those that hold the purse strings in your organization of like what will be the benefits of devoting the time and resource to this. It's not just being best in class at reporting, it's also being able to identify and to an extent quantify the risk exposure and where there's opportunities. And you see, as a result, resilience and adaptation narratives rising up the agenda, which showcases those values of provisioning and regulating services. And then last of all, before handing back the floor to you guys, that there are reputational and revenue opportunities here. So LEAP's going to enable engagement efforts to be prioritized. I mean, there's only so many collective investor engagements that can be prioritized, of course, and so you do have coordinated action under, say, Nature Action 100. What to focus on after issues such as deforestation, and LEAP's really going to allow us to prioritize that and to understand what targets are the most meaningful to set and therefore engage upon. And Malcolm spoke a little bit about the measurement side, and of course, if you've gone through the process of LEAP, then you've got various aspects of nature that you're now measuring and that you'll have metrics in relation to that you can then develop claims and targets off the back of. So, a baseline and an understanding enables you to make a claim about, well, what direction is that baseline heading in, and that then enables there to be an outcome which you could potentially support the creation of a strategy, an investment strategy off the back of, or a piece of financing off the back of. So just to make that super real, a number of these things already exist and have existed for a number of years. This relates to the circular economy agenda sometimes, but there are other parts that it relates to as well. So the first one, interestingly, is actually a traceability target. So this is an incentive to try and improve the knowledge about what the interface with nature is. So this is a Thai fishing conglomerate, and the incentive there on the sustainability linked debt was to increase the amount of tuna in the supply chain that would be monitored. And then the one below from Uruguay, so sovereign-linked sovereign debt. Again, there's a simple incentive there to improve against the baseline the amount of forest area cover. So yeah, an outcome-based instrument. And then last of all, there with carbon, you have a more resource efficiency focused instrument. So the amount of water, given that there's pretty decent information related to water, and the amount of reuse or recycling, again, something that would be commonly reported by the company, allows there to be incentives on that point. So again, we've spoken earlier on about how, from a circular economy point of view, there's already action being taken to contribute towards nature positive, and you see this in these instruments here. And Inka, you were going to share one from Finland, correct? Yeah. Yes.
That's correct. Thank you, Ron. Mm-hmm. So one example from the Finnish market as far as I know, UPM is still the only Finnish company that has tied its loan margin to their biodiversity targets. We have a room full of banks here. Do you have any other knowledge? So 2020, UPM took this 750 million revolving credit facility for 5 years, and the margin has been tied to their climate and biodiversity goals. And the biodiversity goal is represented here, so it's the achievement of a net positive impact on biodiversity. UPM has announced this target already in 2018, and they have been developing the methodology for this ever since. And here are the metrics. So all the metrics you can see here, for example, share of the broadleaf trees or deadwood volumes. So there are kind of generally acknowledged biodiversity indicators for forests, for example, deadwood, lahopuu in Finnish. So there are thousands of forest species that are dependent on deadwood. So it's very important to have that enough in the forests. There is no scientific framework behind this development work, at least not yet. But UPM is still developing those. And the baseline year is 2019, so that's the year that they're comparing their progress in the target. Thank you.
No, thanks, Inka. It's super interesting. Okay, we've got a Menti coming up, but just key takeaways: useful framework for identifying what nature-related claims could be pursued and why, and that existing products already do exist. I want to ask a question to the room, and then super.